doing that by first trying to measure economic performance, and I'll use some what we call proxy data. It's never precise. It always has to be estimated, but we've got much better data than you might think for so long ago. And then we'll look at some comparison with other societies, data from other pre-modern societies, and then propose a theory relating citizen-centered organizations in a small state ecology, that is, a ecology in which there were many small states interacting with one another, and proposing how that relates to economic growth. And then developing some testable hypotheses from that basic theory, running the hypotheses against Greek history over the long run to see whether the hypothesis is supported or not supported. So here's the theory, and here's what I'm going to end up trying to argue for. So we sort of start out with, just the background conditions of the Greek world: certain geography, resources, certain kind of climate, a collapse of a previous civilization, the Bronze Age civilization that, in a sense, wiped the slate clean in the Greek world, and then thinking about the human capacity for innovation and change. Then we move to the next level. This is basically the political inputs, what's happening politically. And here we have some fair rules, at least for citizens, competition among states. This is going to drive capital investment, human capital, social capital, material capital, lower transaction costs. Competition drives innovation. Technological innovation, but also innovation in institutions, and makes for rational cooperation. That is, it's rational for people to cooperate with one another towards common ends. These together drive specialization of economic function, drive exchange over time between states, between people within states, and information and goods and services. It encourages learning, emulation of successful practices, social mobility, political and social mobilization. And all of this then leads to what we call efflorescence, that is, economic growth, creative destruction of processes that aren't working, higher stock of knowledge, high culture. So that's the theory. That's what we want to try to see. Does that all make sense? Classical Greece is distinctive in its institutional development. The city-state, the polis in Greek, is a distinctive form of social organization. These are small, independent states. We'll get back to this map, but that's a map of the independent states of the Greek world in about the time of Aristotle in the 4th century BC. And furthermore, distinctive in that many of these states were, relatively speaking, democratic, not democratic fully in the way we would think of in a 21st century sense, certainly, but democratic in the sense that large numbers of people who were socially diverse, rich and poor, from different kinds of occupations, had standing and were part of a citizen body. Okay, classical Greece is also remarkably data rich due to intensive archaeology since the 19th century and recent encyclopedic work, including this terrific inventory by Mons Hansen and Thomas Nielsen, Danish scholars. They created standardized information for over 1,000 Greek city-states, polis, for a long period of time, from 800 to the time of the death of Alexander the Great. That's 323 BCE. My team digitized the work of this Danish team, and therefore what you'll be seeing is the results of much of the work that was done by the Danes and their associates, and then our digitization. The data should warn you remains by modern standards sparse and noisy, but it is, so I claim anyway, adequate to test the hypothesis that, or the hypotheses that I'm going to present to you. And so historians of antiquity, including some of my colleagues here at Stanford, Walter Scheidel, Ian Morris, Richard Saller, are able to employ the theories and models and methods of contemporary social science when we're trying to better understand what's going on in the ancient world. So the Greek world I think of as a market-like ecology of states. Hellas, that is the general ancient Greek name for the extended Greek world, these 1,000 city-states of the classical period. It's the largest, longest lasting, or at least longest lasting documented ecology of city-states anywhere in world history. Once again, there was work by the great Mons Hansen that demonstrated this. It's a prominent example of what's called peer polity interaction, that is, polities, states, that in one sense or another understand each other as peers instead of simply having an empire that has a bunch of subjects. In a system of many small states, and so small states being quite different from the kind of really great imperial states we think of as dominant through much of modern history. So the history of the Greek world then allows us to test what we can call neo-Hobbesian claims for the economic value of centralization. Neo-Hobbesian claims basically say you need great big centralized systems in order to actually have sustained growth. So you need an empire if you want to go anyplace. The Greek world arguably went someplace, at least in terms of economic development and cultural development, and never had this kind of centralized system. So it allows us to test, indeed, arguably to falsify the neo-Hobbesian claim. And second, it allows us to test theories of causal relationships between regime types and economic change. So there have been a number of arguments that democracy or relatively more democratic systems are conducive to economic growth that have tended to focus on the modern world or the early modern world to the modern world. We can now test those theories against a different database, a unique database that takes us back to the ancient world. So political and economic development in the long run. The run is from basically the late Bronze Age, about 1300 BCE, up to the early modern period, about 1900 of our age, the current era. We'll be looking at two sort of groups of city-states. One of the city-states of core Greece, that is basically the territory of the modern Greek state in about 1890. So we're talking about really the area right in around here. And in the second, the larger catchment is the entire Greek world. That is the world of states in which city-states were developed, in which Greek was the primary language. And that's not only this core area of Greece, but extends out to southern Italy, to Sicily, to much of the west coast of what is now Turkey, around the Black Sea, and then with outposts in North Africa. So here's the basic argument, or the basic results, I should say, from the archaeological evidence that we're able to put together, along with other kinds of documentary evidence for change over time from about 1300 BCE here to 1900 of our era here. So with the midpoint right around here with the changeover from BCE to CE. And we're looking at now two kinds of data. One is population in millions in the gray line here, and then consumption, that is how much an individual can consume, understood as multiples of bare subsistence. So if you have a one in terms of consumption, then you've got enough food and shelter to stay alive, but you're just at the edge of not being alive. If you have double that, you're doing better. If you have triple that, you're doing considerably better. So the idea is that how do we change from about double consumption here in the Bronze Age for a typical individual, dropping down to close to one, dropping down to close to catastrophic level in this collapse of the Bronze Age period, up to the classical era in which we have a lot more people and they're doing a lot better each individually. They're consuming more. And then over time, this drops down again, getting really kind of very low, consumption levels low, population really low in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, and then finally in modernity, beginning to come back up again. So if we multiply consumption times population, we're just once again just limiting ourselves to poor Greece now because we have better archaeological evidence for this area than we do for the more extended area. Here's what we get. So this is population times consumption, and so we get a way to think about change over time, about economic change over time. How many people and how well are they doing? And if we think about being at about in the time of Homer, not very many people not doing very well. Jump over to the time of Marcus Aurelius, they're certainly doing a lot better. By the time we're at around the time of Karl Marx, we're not doing very well at all. Once again, in Greece, they finally begin to do somewhat better around 1900 and thereafter. But if we look at the period that we're most interested in this talk, that is the era of, say, Plato and Aristotle in this high classical period, you see that things have just gotten better and better and better. They peak out around here. They get a little bit worse as we go there, and then we're back into here in the Roman era again. So the question then is, how do we get up here to this classical efflorescence, this really high level of consumption and population for the Greek world, compared to what we can call the pre-modern normal? I mean, this is sort of where Greece just settles down if things aren't going rather differently than they usually have throughout this very long period of time. So how do we explain what's going on up here? That's really the puzzle that I'm trying to address. So, are these numbers? Do they make any sense? Can we actually test them independently against a body of evidence that is separate from the kinds of things that I'm going to be focusing on for the most part? And if we sort of take the average of 400 to 300 BCE, we'll put it about there, and then around a little later, the Hellenistic period from 200 to 100, say, and then the early Roman period around 100 to 200 AD. And so we have these sort of this high dropping down, further down. Is there any way to really test that? Well, actually, there is. I mean, happily, Anna Lagia in 2015 published a really important work on protein intake in the Athenian diet. This was based on bone studies in which you can actually study the amount of protein that has been eaten by the population. More protein, you're doing better off. Less protein, less well off. That's just a general truth. And once again, here's exactly the same pattern. The classical period is the high point. The Hellenistic period here is a midpoint. Imperial Roman period is somewhat lower. So the data I'm going to be focusing on gives us this information. Analogia's completely independent study gives us the same pattern. So it at least looks as if something really is going on. As Lagia points out, that a decline in protein levels from the classical period to the Imperial Roman times was significant. So this is just how she sorted her evidence. Okay, so let's think about the shape of the Greek world. It's this decentralized ecology of many small states, no final imperial center. Um, Plato said it well. He said the Earth is very large, and we Greeks live in a small part of it, about the sea. He says, like ants or frogs around a pond. And here's that this is the idea. The pond is basically the Mediterranean, or maybe the extended pond with the Black Sea as well. And here are the Greeks living typically around the shores of the Mediterranean, clustered in these areas that were relatively close to the seashore. Uh, we can rank these city-states by size. The bigger ones in dark blue, the sort of middle-sized ones in middle blue and on down. Once again, just to give you a sense that there's a scattering of different size city-states across this ecology, none of them very big, all of them very small by modern standards, but a really substantial difference in size across the ecology. So here we can actually sort them out in terms of how big really are they? So the ones are the really small ones, the sevens are the really big ones. And We can here give you a sense of the estimated average population of a type 1 polis, compared to a type 7 polis. Once again, population averaging out around 150,000 in the very largest ones, but between 75,000 and 250,000. Uh, the point is that most polis were really small, even by Greek standards. 4/5 of the polis are either sort of ones, twos, or threes. So, a population of not more than 25,000 people, and yet about 2/3 of the Greeks, if we began to actually count up how many people lived in each one of these city-states, well, lived in the larger Greek city-states. Now that's important, as we'll see, because if we think about all of these cities or all of these states as really tiny and not densely populated, we're going to have certain limits that well, we wouldn't be able to explain the kind of growth that we're getting. But on the other hand, the larger cities, the larger states with larger cities that they're centered around are going to have some challenges they're going to have to meet. They're going to have some health challenges. In the early modern period, large cities tend to be very unhealthy places. Greece is an exception, as we'll see. Okay, so here we can track the size, how many of these cities do we have of a certain size. So the number of polis here that are have a population of a certain size. And you can see, once again, most of them are relatively small. Just a few of them are really very large by Greek standards. And this fame measure is how much do we know about them? And the point is that we know very little about most of them. These are, we only have a little bit of evidence here. We have much more evidence for these few really large cities. So one of the challenges is extrapolating from the relatively well-documented large cities to the relatively ill-documented smaller cities. Greek history is, as Herodotus said, is a history of small and great city-states alike. So we want to measure economic change over time. That's our goal. We're going to have to come up with some proxies for assessing economic performance. And so we're going to come up with some change over time measures, demographic growth, the size of houses, supply of coined money, and investment in civic infrastructure. And then we're also going to look at some comparative measures. We're going to look at differences between the Greek world and other pre-modern societies in terms of population density, level of urbanization, median income, and non-elite consumption, and then level of inequality. So change over time within the Greek world. If we're talking about the core Greek world, we're going from a very low population in millions of, maybe a third of a million people at the low point, at the collapse of the Bronze Age, up to probably about 3 million people by the time of Aristotle. The wider Greek world was growing much faster, and indeed up to probably about 8.5 million people in this wider ecology. But once again, we see this is really pretty dramatic growth over this roughly 700-year period. The houses are getting a lot bigger. And once again, this is due to archaeological field work that has measured the ground floors of Greek houses. We typically don't have the second floor of ancient Greek houses. All we have is the archaeological remains, but we have a pretty good sense of how Greek houses were built with second floors like this. So if we include hypothetical second floors, this is what we get. If we get ground plans, this is what we get. Here we have the time of Homer. We think about 750 BCE roughly to the time of Aristotle on this timeline here. The size in terms of meters squared. And once again, it just goes up dramatically, especially if we include the second floor. But even if we don't, even the ground plan is increasing. So average houses are going up really very dramatically. Minting of coins. The Greek world is one of two places. The other was China that minted coinage. The Greeks minted silver primarily, but also some gold and quite a lot of bronze. But we get a spread of coinage from the 6th century BCE through the 4th century BCE. And we get a lot of places that are coining. The beige dots are places, are city-states that do not. We don't have coinage from them, but all the others are city-states that do issue their own coinage. And we can measure because we can count the number of coins and the number of coin hoards that are found. We can talk in the Q&A about what a coin hoard is and how this is all measured. But the bottom line is, once again, studying archaeological evidence, we can show in the 6th century, not many hoards of coins being found and not many total coins being found. 5th century, many more. And by the time we're in the 4th century, we're really exploding in terms of, once again, a rough indication of how much money was circulating around the Greek world. The median and the coin hoard size increases substantially. The mean, the average coin hoard, the size increases dramatically. So we're getting some very big coin hoards. We're getting big, big pots of money being basically buried in the ground and not collected by the people who buried them. That's how we know that that's how we find it archaeologically. We're getting more investment in civic infrastructure. Here's just one example of civic infrastructure. We could study temples. We could study other kinds of things. We've already talked about private housing. But this is walls around the city, fortified cities. So once again, if we start about at the time of around the time of Homer, around in here, basically, we don't have fortified cities. We begin to get them around 700, 500 BC, time of the Persian Wars. We have somewhat more. By the time of Aristotle, if you've got a reasonable sized city that's been archaeologically investigated, it's probably got a wall around it. So once again, big investments in this kind of really massive stone architecture. And once again, we can do this by time, and we can show that how the bigger and smaller cities had walls around them. So if we did a summary of all of the proxy indicators of relative economic growth from 800 to 300 BCE, we can do sort of multipliers from the earlier time then to the later time, century over century. And whatever we study, the multipliers are large, whether it's population or house floor plans, household goods, per capita consumption. Aggregate growth, the number of people's names we know, the horde sizes we talked about, and so on. So everything we can measure is going up pretty dramatically from this period. Now we do some comparison between societies. So let's look at the rate of urbanization. This is percentage of the total population that is living in towns of more than 5,000 people. Now, today we think of a town of 5,000 people as a village. Is it even a town? But in pre-modern period, 5,000 people is a big urban conglomeration. And this is the standard way that pre-modern economic historians study urbanization. So here's the point. In the period, the Greek world, about the time of Aristotle, we've got about a third of people living in towns of more than 5,000 in urbanized areas. We go to the Roman Empire, it's only about 10%. France, just on the verge of the revolution, about the same. Holland in the 17th century, probably as it were, gold standard for a modernizing early modern state is at about 45%. But jumping back to England at the time of the Glorious Revolution, very much like Rome or France. So not until England and Wales break into the 19th century that they have an urbanization rate that is similar to the Greek world in the time of Aristotle. And surprisingly, although the population is increasingly urbanized, the average age at death is increasing. Here we're once again looking at skeletal studies. There's a lot of complications with skeletal studies and figuring out the age of people, but this is close enough anyway. And once again, we look at this kind of early Iron Age nadir, when things were probably at their worst, things are pretty grim. This is looking at different ways of measuring the male and female skeletons. The point is, it's always going up. If we look from the early Iron Age, say the time of Homer, to the time of Aristotle, people are living longer. So they're becoming more urbanized, but they're living longer. Once again, this runs against the norm of modernization in, say, the early modern period in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, when cities tend to be death traps. So once again, we can go to Analogia's announcement or analysis, looking at these isotopes, the bone studies, and the amount of protein in the diet overall. And she says, overall evidence suggests that the largest part of the population enjoyed a high quality dietary level during adult life. And this is one of the reasons people are living longer, right? So they have better health, they're eating better. They are making more money. They are able to afford more food, as well as bigger houses and other kinds of things that conduce to better health and the possibility of having more people, more surviving children. So here we're looking at some data that my colleague Walter Scheidel pulled together. It's a whole bunch of different societies trying to figure out average wages of working people. Now, this isn't, elite craftsmen, much less, very wealthy people. These are wages of unskilled laborers. And each one of these dots is a society. Here we're going from the 18th century BCE, so way back, up to the 18th century of our era. And The point is the higher up you are here, the better off you're doing. This is the numbers of wheat equivalent that you're getting in daily pay. So imagine you take your salary and you ask, how many liters of wheat could I buy with my salary today, my daily salary? Well, you could probably, most of you buy a lot of liters of wheat, but most people throughout early times, certainly if we're considering in here, can't buy very much at all, can't buy enough to do more than stay, fairly close to subsistence. Athens in the 5th century BCE, which we can measure pretty well, is quite high. Athens in the 4th century BCE is very high. A few other outliers here we could talk about, but they're rare. Once again, the point here is that wages are really high compared to other pre-modern societies. Here, once again, sort of the normal, ancient medieval normal is down here, and we're much, much higher when we're up here, say, with Athens in the 5th or 4th centuries. This is just working out the wheat wage in liters per day, and then multiplier times bare survival. So Athens in the 4th century, somewhere in the range of 3.7 to 4.6 times bare survival. Remember that early, we're talking about the multiplier times survival. Holland, roughly similar. Holland in the 16th to 18th century, once again, golden standard for a society that's doing very well, paying its workers very well compared to other pre-modern societies. So how fairly was the wealth of this society being distributed? If wealth is distributed very unequally, then even though you have a high GDP, high gross domestic product, it may be that many people are doing extremely badly. Now, certainly some people in the Greek world were doing badly. It's certainly nothing like an egalitarian distribution. But on the other hand, it is much less unequal than other pre-modern societies. So here, this is just an example of trying to create a model of income and the population for the city-state of Athens in about the time of Aristotle in the 330s. And what we've done is created a bunch of groups. We're imagining the sort of social status of these different groups. Slaves, it's a slave society. Medics, these are resident foreigners, and then citizens. And then the size of the estate, and then how many estates of this sort were there, and then how many people were there in each of these estates. We're imagining many slaves just live, just one person. Many other, the medics and citizens are living in family groups. Total then group population of each, trying to figure out the wages per day. We have some evidence for this. How many days do they work? How many, therefore, drachmas, the standard Athenian monetary unit per year. This is talents. That's a larger monetary unit. And then we can figure out how many talents per year was each of these groups making. We can figure out roughly then where the median is, about the middle of the distribution, from richer down here. These are the very wealthiest to the poorest up there. And ultimately then you can generate a population model. Once again, this is to some extent hypothetical, but it is based on actual evidence. And so we can say the mean income, the average income, is about 4.5 times subsistence. The We can figure out the top income share, what percentage it was of total income, about 16%. The median income is about 3.5 times subsistence. And so we can say the median income is about 74% of the mean, that is the average income. And ultimately, we can sort of roughly sort this into classes, sort of a lower class, a middle class, and an upper class. The point here is the middle class, the people who are doing reasonably well, 2.5 times, 4 times subsistence, is really substantial. It's more than half the population, according to this model. And once we've done all of that work, we can generate a standard Gini coefficient of inequality. So the Gini coefficient is a standard way of trying to measure how unequal a society is. All societies are unequal in one way and another. You can do inequality in terms of total wealth or inequality in terms of annual income. This is income inequality. Bottom line is the lower the Gini number, the more equal the society. The higher the number, the more unequal the society. And so we can compare Athens, according to the model I just devised, and the Gini is a relatively low 38. The Roman Empire is somewhat higher. So once again, this is sort of fitting what we had thought was happening when we estimated total population and total consumption. That is, as societies become more unequal, there are going to be people are going to be on the average consuming less, and you're going to have likely to have a drop in population because the people are doing less well in terms of raising children and so on. So this isn't all the entire. This is comparing it to the entire Roman Empire. There are parts of the Roman Empire that are doing much better. But the Greek world in the classical period is doing better than the Roman Empire overall. So here's another way to measure inequality. In some ways, it's a better way, I think, for pre-modern societies. This is what Milanovich, economist, and his associates call the inequality possibility frontier. So you basically go from the gross domestic income per capita in some standard number. So, and then the Gini index here. So from lowest, the most equal to most unequal. And what they basically say is if you're on this inequality possibility frontier, you're very near to bare subsistence. A lot of people are at the level of starvation. And this is we can see from Rome here is fairly close. Some other societies, sorry, this is jumping on me, very close to subsistence, very close to starvation. The further you're away from this frontier, the better your population is doing. So here we have Holland, a long way from the frontier, England, quite a long way from the frontier. Here's Athens in the 330s, once again, a long way away from the frontier. Just a way of measuring in a sense, the social safety net, the likelihood you are going to starve, much higher for many people in these societies, much less in Athens. Athens is just where we can measure this more accurately. The whole of the Greek world we can't measure accurately. So income inequality comparisons, we can do the Gini coefficient once again. If you think equality is better than inequality, low is good, then you can compare here. Mean income this is multiples of subsistence. Here, high is good. And here we have the inequality extraction ratio, which is the thing that Milanovic and company are trying to measure. Here, once again, like the Gini coefficient, low is good. So Athens very low on this inequality in extraction ratio compared to these other pre-modern societies. If we look at inequality in different ways, distribution of agricultural land, this is completely separate work that's done by a really excellent Spanish scholar, Gallego, once again concludes that the distribution of land in 4th century BCE Athens was reasonably egalitarian compared to other cases. So with a Gini coefficient of 0.44. So it's not going to be identical to the income Gini coefficient, but in this case, it's fairly close. We can look at Athenian wealth distribution, at least among citizens. Here, wealth inequality is always much higher than income inequality. But once again, Athens is relatively low compared to these various other societies. It's around the USA in the 1950s, which was really sort of the high point of equality, wealth equality in our country, or Canada. But once again, going to Lagia's data, Lagia argues that there are not, argues against the occurrence of significant population differences with respect to adult diet. She looks at different populations, different groups of burials across the Athenian territory. Some appear to be very poor and some to be relatively rich burials, but the bones show that people were eating in reasonably similar kind of way. They were eating reasonably similar amounts of protein at any rate. So once again, this looks like it confirms relatively low inequality. In contrast to relatively high inequality in terms of who's eating what, how much protein people are getting much earlier in Greece in the Bronze Age or in the later medieval periods, once again, when our evidence suggests that there were many fewer people living at a much lower level of subsistence. So once again, low inequality fits housing patterns. If you look at the smallest houses, these are the houses that are in the 25th percentile of house size, and then the larger houses in the 75th percentile, so much larger houses. Only a quarter of the houses are bigger, and here only a quarter of the houses are smaller. They're remarkably similar, remarkably close. They're both getting much larger over time, but they're not diverging spectacularly. Once again, evidence for over time staying relatively equal. In fact, probably becoming relatively more equal. Other evidence from housing across the Greek world, for example, at Olynthus. Once again, we're looking at a Gini coefficient in terms of housing sizes, and it's really quite low compared to, once again, some other comparative evidence. So if you believe what I've just argued, that Greece does have economic growth over time, and it's quite dramatic, and has relatively low inequality. How do we explain this? Why does this happen? So the hypothesis then is that fair rules, that is equal and open access to institutions and fierce competition within a market-like ecology of states, incentivized capital investment, that's human, social, and financial capital, rewarded innovation by individuals and by states, while lowering transaction costs, lowering the costs of making exchanges that were mutually beneficial between individuals or between states. And so here we are. That was where we started with the theory that I said I was going to try to demonstrate, and this is where I would argue we begin to get to an explanatory story with fair rules, with competition, capital investment, innovation, driving specialization and exchange, with learning and emulation, leading to efflorescence. If we go to history, does that really pan out? And I think arguably it does. This is not going to be anything like a history lesson. We don't have time for that. There are wonderful courses at Stanford and elsewhere that you can take that will teach you a lot about this. But just briefly, if you think about the 10th to the 11th, or the 11th to the 10th centuries BCE, after this collapse of the Bronze Age society, we do have very egalitarian um, societies, but very poor. So everybody is not very different, but there are equally poor in these small geographically isolated villages. But we get remarkable recovery in the 9th to 6th centuries as competition between these coalescing city states favors communities with high mobilization that can get a lot of people doing the same thing, whether it's militarily or commercially. High morale, people are trusting each other, willing to work together. We get innovative, egalitarian civic institutions, not once again egalitarian by our standards, but certainly by ancient standards. Stabilize the equality of high political standing among adult males. Whole another story if we talk about gender, whole another story about if we talk about enslaved people. This isn't simply a happy story. It's simply a story about why we get growth. More egalitarian civic states mobilize more high morale warriors. And this allows for egalitarian civic regimes proving to be adaptive in this multi-state ecology, adaptive in that these states that get with high mobilization, high mobility, high innovation, are able to dominate their neighbors. They get and stay bigger, while strong local and civic identities limit territorial expansion. So they get bigger up to a point, but they don't become great empires, right? Because of this very strong civic identity, which limits territorial expansion. Population pressure drives colonization. So the Greeks send out colonies throughout southern Italy, through Sicily, into North Africa, as we saw. These citizen-centered institutions make the Greeks more effective colonizers. Once again, this doesn't have to be told as a happy story. The people who were colonized are obviously not all in favor of this, but it does allow the Greek world to expand into these what were originally non-Greek territories, Sicily, North Africa, for example. So colonization then is a process that rewards citizen-centered rules. If you are able to work cohesively together, if you are able to trust one another, you can, in fact, take over new territory more effectively. Colonization rewards specialization and exchange as the Greeks move into areas that are more fertile in terms of growing wheat, for example. You can get relative advantage. Wheat growing areas can exchange with more industrial areas. So the Athenians become specialists in making these beautiful clay vases and exchange for wheat that is grown in Greek cities in Italy. And egalitarian rules reward high individual human capital investments. So, for example, Spartan military training, big human capital investment in military training, or in the Athenian pottery industry, big investment in becoming a really good potter, a really good pottery painter, and drives specialization, information exchange among individuals, among states, drives learning, competitive emulation. Gosh, those guys are doing it awfully well. Maybe we should do it like they are doing it. Drives a tendency to convergence among city states on what we might call institutional best practices. And this will give us a series of, if this is all true, it gives us a series of predictions following from the hypothesis that institutions featuring fair rules, offering competitive advantage, should prove adaptive, will be widely adopted across the ecology of Greek city-states. And this explains a lot of the features of Greek civilization. It's one of the arguments of the book in a lot of more historical detail. So prediction based on these hypotheses, refinement of these fairness rules under competitive pressure, and convergence of polis upon adaptive institutions. We see it. Democracy and federalism are two institutional forms that in fact are spread across this Greek ecology of states. Creative destruction, we should see failure of states that do not follow the convergence pattern. Sparta does very well, but by the 370s was falling apart. It wasn't following convergence at that point. Typically, the tyrant-dominated polis of Sicily. Expansion of the polis world as adaptive polis institutions are adopted by Greek neighbors. That actually does happen in Western Anatolia, up in Macedon. And we should get more specialization and more mobile specialists. And indeed, we do. We have people moving all over this world, lots of evidence for that. Refinement of fairness rules under competition, pressure and convergence, democracy. Once again, we can show this in some detail. A lot of innovations and refinements in democratic institutions at Athens, constitutional law, executive accountability, taxation, military organization. Key institutions proved to be really stable, a kind of federalism, citizen councils, people's courts. They turn out to really work and to work over time. And these institutions then are adopted by other city-states. And we can watch this happening as these institutional forms, which work really well at Athens, spread across the Greek culture. So is democracy really an advantage? Well, yes, it does seem to be. State capacity, which is this dark line here, does track very closely to the democracy line, which is the dotted line. How democratic is the place as this scale? And then here, once again, just a time scale. Pre-democratic era, not doing that well in capacity, doesn't have very much democracy. Once the Macedonians take over, not as democratic, and state capacity declines. So once again, we get high state capacity in the democratic era. We do get real shocks, real performance failures, temporary collapse of democracy here and here. But we get then robust rebounding from shocks. And we get other times when there are some really severe shocks, wars and so on, in which we don't get democracy collapsing. So once again, we get the capacity to bounce back to democracy after shocks, and then the capacity to survive shocks. Once again, it's just, it works, and therefore it's borrowed elsewhere. We can look at transition of Greek city-states from democracy to oligarchy and back and forth. The bottom line is that oligarchy loses ground to democracy. We can go back to this slide if somebody wants to look at it more carefully. So we can count up the regimes of oligarchy, tyranny, kingship, democracy. And here the blue line, democracy, is gaining ground over time. Oligarchies do very well for a while and then collapse. Once again, other kinds, tyranny does pretty well, collapses. Well, finally, the Greek world doesn't last forever independently, conquered by Macedon, later conquered by Rome. And then we have to think about, so the political fall, and we have to think about why didn't the political fall mean a complete collapse down to that pre-modern normal? Although there's a decline in economic well-being, and decline in number of people, and decline in multiplier of subsistence, it doesn't collapse very quickly. So we have to explain both of those two things. We'll try to be very quick. Well, the political fall. How come the Macedonians take over? And at least one key reason is that highly skilled specialists in fields relevant to military and financial success are very mobile and they're available for hire. So the rulers of Macedon, Philip II and Alexander III, known as Alexander the Great, grasped the value of Greek city-state institutions and the expertise developed within that market-like ecology. They selectively emulate and adapt Greek institutions. They hire Greek experts, drive innovation that make Imperial Macedon becomes a true empire in some ways like a city-state, not in all ways, but they borrowed what they want to borrow, and they're able to really do well, at least in the short run. So growing specialization and transfer of ideas and goods and services within the ecology help to explain ultimately the political fall as well as the economic rise of classical Greece. But why is there relative sustained prosperity? After Alexander the Great, the Greek world is in one sense dominated by these great kings who carve out big empires for themselves or kingdoms for themselves. Why didn't they why didn't the economy simply collapse? And the answer is we have to have the premise. The Macedonian kings, and especially the ones who came after them, were basically warlords. They were seeking plunder. So at a counterfactual, they would just plunder the city-states completely, and that would collapse this whole efflorescence. The whole thing should go to that pre-modern normal of really low population, low subsistence. But in fact, it doesn't happen. The Hellenistic Greek world overall did pretty well economically. The polis culture really expanded when we get out of or Greece into Western Anatolia, into modern-day Turkey. We see city-states, just new city-states growing up. Many of them enjoyed local autonomy, and indeed democracy continues to expand. Many of these new city-states are internally democratic. How could this be if we have warlord kings marching around saying, fee, fi, fo, fum, give me your all of your wealth or I'll destroy your city? The answer is taxes that are paid to the kings were negotiated, not imposed. So how is that? Well, remember all that infrastructure we were talking about, city-states building big walls? Those walls really meant something. Aristotle, writing in the Politics, really got it in the part in red here. Not only must walls be put around a city, but attention must be paid to them in order that they may be suitable in respect of military requirements, especially the new devices recently invented. He means catapults. If you do the right thing, if your defenders are willing to defend, potential aggressors then do not even start attempting to attack those who are well prepared, have a really good wall, and have citizens willing to defend the wall, right? This then is, I think, the explanation. Here's a little game theoretic story to try to explain that. I'm not going to walk through this. The bottom line is that here's the king that has to choose, do I negotiate or do I threaten to take over the city? The city has to decide to resist or not to resist, to give up, to submit. The elite of the city have to decide: will we support a democracy, or will we not support a democracy? Are we willing to, simply say, "Hey, let's just have an oligarchy now"? If they don't have a democracy, basically the king's more likely to attack, and the city's more likely to have to pay high taxes. they have a democracy, the king is less likely to attack because there are more people defending the wall. The probability, this L is a lottery, that if the city he attacks and the city is democratic, there's a much higher chance that his attack will fail. And the king doesn't want to have an attack that fails. It's expensive. It's embarrassing. He wastes a lot of time and energy. Bottom line is when you work out the the likely probability of success, depending on whether you have democracy or not a democracy, the king pretty much is likely to negotiate. So you have negotiated tax rates rather than plunder, and therefore you have democracy rather than not democracy. And therefore we maintain something like the conditions that I was talking about. So this Hellenistic world, the post-classical world, inherits some of the features of the world I've been talking about. Well, quick conclusions. Classical Greece was wealthy, populous, urbanized, very high levels of consumption compared to at least earlier or later periods of Greek history, compared to the Bronze Age or the medieval period, and compared to other pre-modern societies. Once again, comparatively low levels of economic inequality. So the wealth is relatively equally distributed, only relatively, not perfectly, and not anything like perfectly, but relatively equally distributed. Wealth and low inequality are correlated. They're products of competition and relatively fair and open political institutions. Democracy allows the relatively less well-off to get a bigger share of the value of social cooperation. Final thoughts, that is just by combining some of the established methods of classics, very humanistic, sort of in a sense, the exemplary humanistic study is classical studies and ancient history with some techniques from social science, learning to work with data, learning to think about how proxies work. We can subject theories about development over time to empirical tests. We can show that some theories fail the test, like the idea of Hobbesian centralization being necessary for economic growth, and others survive. The hypothesis I've been arguing for, the theory about competition and the right kind of cooperation driving economic growth over time. And so we begin to make some progress in our attempt to explain and not just describe the ancient past. And having done that, we may learn more about what is possible for us. The past is not going to give us any simple lessons, just do this and you'll be fine. But it does give us a way to think about our own condition, adding, in a sense, an entire case study to what we're able to think with when we think about economic development and its relationship to, broadly speaking, democratic development, is some justification for doing all that hard work of learning Greek and reading Homer and so on. So that's it. Thank you very much, and I really welcome your questions. Kyle, I assume maybe you'll pull some questions out and offer them to me because I'd probably be a mess at trying to figure out my own.
Oh, yes, no worries. Yeah, and thank you so much for that excellent presentation. We did receive a ton of questions, so I will try to get through as many as we can here with the time we have left. And thank you everyone for asking such great questions and for paying attention and being involved in the chat. So I'll start from the very beginning here. We got a question from Andres. Can you please explain? This was kind of earlier in your presentation. Can you
Mhm.
please explain the acronym in the x-axis LH equals late Hellenic, ER early
Yeah,
Roman?
right. Sorry, late Helladic. It's a yeah. I'm sorry about that. Was so the yeah. That's just a let me get that one back here. And the I'm sorry. LH is later Hellenistic, early Roman. Okay, so classic EH is classical early Hellenistic. So the slides are going to be available to you. Kyle is going to make those. So if those of you who want to, go back and look at these again, feel free to do so. And if somebody wants me to put
Absolutely.
up another slide, I can go back into the slideshow. So, but that's what. Yeah. So I'm sorry. Late Hellenistic is the LH.
And so this was a few minutes later on one of your other slides. This question from Tanya saying, "How is fame being quantified?"
Great question, Tanya. Thank you. Fame is quantified by the number of here. Maybe I will go back into the slideshow. Okay, here's fame. So this is based on that inventory by the two Danish scholars who create this great volume. It's about 1,000 pages. It has an entry for each one of the 1,035 Greek city-states that they think that there's any evidence at all for them existing. So they have they really worked hard to get sort of a standard approach to how the scholars who wrote up these entries wrote them up. They had a really strict editorial oversight over the whole thing. So what these numbers are columns in that inventory. So here you have point 12, just a bit of a column, a few lines, up to about 21 columns in that inventory. It's very rough, and actually it underestimates how much we know about the ones we know a lot about, because we know much more than 20 columns worth. And really, we only know a few words worth about some of these very small ones. But it was just, so it's a very rough proxy. But it is a proxy that, interestingly enough, does capture pretty closely what we know about the size of these city-states.
Great. And let's see, another question here from Sangita says, larger houses in the classical era, were that a reflection of economic prosperity or people having more kids and hence larger families?
Yeah, it probably is having larger families. Although we can certainly see societies that have, relatively large families in relatively small places. If there is, in modernity, the right conditions that people can have higher health because they have vaccinations and so on, and yet haven't had the economic growth to have larger houses. But in, this period, I think it's all running together. People are able to have more living children, so they need more space, but they have the wealth to actually build not only larger, because that's really the only thing we're measuring in that in those houses. So not only larger, but also much better built, much more solidly built. We go back to the houses we know from here, and they're very, they simply don't have very complex building. No, it's not complex architecture. They simply can't use very large blocks. They can't move large things. They just don't have the technology to do it. So we're getting bigger and better houses. And I think, once again, they're more spacious. They're housing more people, but it's when you're becoming more prosperous in a pre-modern society in which we haven't changed anything drastically about medicine, right? We haven't figured out inoculations and that sort of thing. But what we have got is people are eating better, and they're being sheltered better. So larger houses, better built houses is going right along with a larger population and a healthier population.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Moving on, another question from Eric. Can you talk a little bit about the political conditions in classical Greece which precipitated the development of demos?
Yes, yes. So the city that we know most about, and we can really trace the political development, is Athens. And Athens, if you look at the period of Athens right around here, say around 600 BCE, has just decided not to have the society break out into a relatively small group of people who are going to own everything, including the bodies of their fellow local Athenians. They've decided to pass a law that says no Athenian can own the person of another Athenian. You can't have, as an Athenian, you can't own an Athenian as a slave. Doesn't mean you can't own other people as slaves, but you can't own people in your own country as slaves, or people who are your own countrymen as slaves. It's the beginning of a decision that we're going to be citizens together in some sense. That makes possible then, by the time we're at about here, in the just at the end of the 6th century, the beginning of the 5th century, is the big democratic revolution. And that's an exciting story. I've written about it. It is a story that has to do with tyranny that becomes oppressive, and a decision by a leader to try to not only resist the tyranny, but to resist the tyranny by embracing the possibility that the ordinary people could be full citizens, bringing the demos into the coalition. Radical move, probably a desperate move at the time, but that then sets and it works. And the people of Athens then become aware of themselves, not only as citizens who have some rights of being enslaved by one another, but who could actually set their own future, who could make their own decisions for themselves. A few years after that, the Persians invade, and the Athenians, because of their new democracy, at least so says the great historian Herodotus, do extraordinarily well in this battle. They fight the Persians at sea in great numbers and do very well. And then democracy really takes off and becomes a real way of doing things, or at least democracy in the ancient sense. Once again, I wish I had time to give you the story of democracy, as I've devoted much of my career to try to work that out in detail. But that's in a tiny little capsule.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that's it's hard to really give people little sound bites about such complicated things here.
Read Greek history. It's a wonderful, wonderful history, and there are some spectacularly well-written histories. No, don't bother to read my stuff. Go read things by my colleague Ian Morris and others.
Let's see. I'm just going to bounce around here to make sure that we get as many questions in as we can. So I see kind of an interesting one here from Oleg. Do you think that Homer actually existed, or is it more likely that he was an amalgamation of multiple bards or poets?
I think very much the second, Oleg. I think there is a moment when the oral traditions of these bards and poets that were clearly had gone on for a long time, clearly hundreds of years. But there's a point in which they are crystallized into a written text. So exactly when that is a matter of debate. I tend to go with the early date of around 750, 725. Some people think it didn't really get fully crystallized until 100 years or so later. So I think that there is a Homer is that moment of crystallization. Maybe there was a guy who said, "Yeah, I'm the last of the great world poets, and damned if I'm not going to use this new technology to write it all down." Maybe there is, once again, a hypothesis that people have said is there's some clever scribe who says, "Well, you, Homer," this guy we call Homer, "sing me the great song of the anger of Achilles," and is writing madly as it goes down. We don't know exactly how this happens, but to think that there's simply a single poet who makes up this whole thing off the top of his head is absolutely the wrong way to think about it. So it is certainly a poetic tradition that crystallizes in a written form through a process that, frankly, we can't recapture.
All right, question here from Andres. Overall, when looking at a map of the Hellenistic world, the vast majority of polis are coastal. There's barely any polis further inland. What kind of economic incentives or political structures drove that feature?
Right. So the Greeks really liked to get out on the sea to trade. It's also true that the inland areas of the Greek world, much of the inland areas of the Greek world, are extremely mountainous, and they're not great for at least very dense populations. But it's not true of all of the inland areas. I think it really is. The coastal areas were seen as desirable early on. And indeed, we get evidence for trade across this Greek world well before even the Bronze Age. There is trade in obsidian, the glass-like rock that is formed from volcanic eruptions, if it all goes right, which is pretty rare in the Mediterranean world. Most of it comes from the island of Milos, right around here. But already in the Neolithic period, when there really isn't any metal technology, we get obsidian from Milos being traded around these coastal settlements around the Greek world. So being on the coast where you can get stuff from other places is from the beginning and through the end seen as a really desirable thing. And all of the really, most of the major city-states are relatively close to the coast, not necessarily right on the coast, but within a few miles inland.
All right, I have another question from Stacy here asking, did I understand correctly that the men lived longer than women in classical Greece?
Probably so. On the whole, the bottom line, Stacy, is childbirth. The childbirth in any pre-modern society is going to be really hard on women. The likelihood is that although men also suffered from various disabilities, including warfare. The likelihood that women died younger, partly through childbirth, perhaps because they were less well fed. But once again, we don't have very good evidence. The big differences between genders in terms of protein, but I think that's heavily a death in childbirth statistic. Sadly, I mean, it's a tragic thing to think of that women probably, for the most part, spent much of their life either pregnant once they've achieved menarche. So you're probably having a series of pregnancies, and not all those kids are going to survive, and not all a certain number of pregnancies, the woman is going to be at risk. We have some evidence for very old women. It's not all, you're not, it's not inevitable. You will die. So I don't want to be too grim about this. But yeah, I think that's probably the answer.
And we received another question that's kind of related to this. What were the rights of women in Greek city-states?
Now there, once again, really good literature on this. So, limits on their rights is they never get anything like full political rights. They don't get to vote in the assembly, even in the heyday of a Greek democracy. They don't get to sit on law courts, once again, as even the poorest Greek citizens in a Greek democracy got to do. Uh, it was imagined, gosh, they could. There are plays about strong women. There are comedies about what if women just took over and ran everything and were in the assembly and so on. So it's imaginable, but it never actually happened. Women had extremely important civic roles, however, in Greek religion. There are every Greek city-state we know of, certainly Athens and the major ones, had woman-only festivals where the women got together, and it was known that the women talked with each other at these festivals. They talked about things that we would think of as being political. They undertook rituals that were absolutely essential for the well-being of the state. The state religion, as it were, incorporates women centrally in many ways, priestesses. So it's not that women are, as it were, separated from the public civic sphere, but they enter the civic sphere through a religious channel rather than a specifically political channel.
All right. We are running out of time here, so we're probably not going to get to everyone, but I'll try to grab some of the folks who I haven't already gotten to yet. Question here from Chris. How would you apply your findings to the political direction of executive power being taken by the current American administration in regard to its impact on the future of democracy and economic health?
Uh, well, you guys ask really small, easy to answer questions, don't you? Well, I think that, certainly if a Greek Democrat were to look at America today, I think that what they would say is, you guys are at risk of tyranny. Now, that's not to say that's what we should say, but I think a Greek would say that. They would say that that sort of concentration of power in the central executive is what we Greeks would call tyranny. They would say, well, when do you Americans all get together to debate the future of your country? Well, we don't really do that. Well, hold it. Well, certainly you have a council that is selected from amongst you that is centrally important, that does all the real work then. Well, maybe not quite so much. Okay, well, at least you all get onto really large juries and you're able to bring to account the powerful and the dangerous among you. So they have to account directly to the people themselves, to big popular juries. Well, we really don't do that either. So the Greek would say, well, like I said, you guys don't really have what we Greeks would call democracy. Now, we would go back and say, well, but your women can't even vote. And so we would have pushback in various ways to them. But I think that the Greeks from the time of Aristotle would have a pretty clear conception that something is a lot of things are not democratic about the current American system, and that's something we might want to think about.
Absolutely, yeah. And let's see. Let's end on this question here. This might be a good one to wrap up with. What would be the best books you would recommend relating to some of the subject matter you've discussed tonight?
Okay, well, there are a lot of really terrific books. I would say, I mean, I'm going to give a pitch for some of my colleagues and friends, but read Ian Morris wrote a terrific textbook on Greek history. If you want to, the story of Greece. That's really excellent. If you want more in terms of the social science of ancient history, read almost anything by my colleague Walter Scheidel, who I've cited already some of his work. If you are fascinated by ancient science and its relationship to ancient folklore, to mythology, the way that stories about technology, for example, in some ways anticipate some of our own problems and thoughts about technology. Read almost anything written by Adrienne Mayor. Mayor. She just happens to be my wife, but I think she's one of the best writers on antiquity. And her work is, I think, rightly thought of as some of the most exciting work that's going on now. I could go on, but those are at least a few recommendations.
All right. Well, I just want to say thank you again, Josiah, for taking the time to chat with our community and educate us, and for taking the time to answer all these good questions. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this tonight.
It's once again just an honor to get to speak to a group being sponsored by the Mountain View Public Library. Go to your local public library and check these books out. You don't need to buy them. You can, in fact, get them for free, and it's part of the lifeblood of our democratic society. So thanks again for this chance.
Absolutely. And also just wanted to thank everyone for tuning in tonight and for being so active in the chat and asking great questions. As we mentioned earlier, I will be sending out the slides and recording of this slideshow as well, of this presentation. So hopefully, if you have any other questions, feel free to contact me and we can always get in touch. And I'll also just want to thank the Friends of the Mountain View Library again for generously sponsoring this program. So with that, I'll say thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
So long.